The day they buried Thomas was the day Alara's world ended for the second time. The first was when the fever took him, stealing the warmth from his hands and the light from his eyes in the space of a week. The second was in the cold, sterile silence of his family's parlor after the last of the mourners had departed, leaving only the scent of funereal lilies and the sharp, cutting presence of his brother, Marcus Gable. Marcus did not waste time with condolences. He was a man built of hard angles and harder certainties, and sentiment was a currency he did not trade in. He laid a single folded document on the polished oak table between them. Thomas left no will, he stated, his voice as flat as the frozen plains outside. As such, his assets, what little there were, revert to the family estate, the house, the tools, the 2 mules. They are Gable property now. Alara said nothing. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her black mourning dress a stark silhouette against the pale wallpaper. She had expected this. The Gables had only ever seen her as a temporary addition to their lineage, a vessel. It was a worthless stretch of wind-scoured rock and ice, a place where nothing grew and no sane person would ever build. The lakebed was frozen solid 8 months of the year, and the wind that came off it was said to shave the flesh from a man's bones. Alara looked at the deed, then at Marcus. His eyes were small and hard, daring her to protest, to beg. She would do neither. She had $27 to her name, the clothes on her back, and a deep, aching grief that had hollowed her out. But inside that hollow space something else was taking root. A cold, quiet resolve that felt like iron. "I will need my husband's axe," she said. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the terror that clawed at her throat. "And his dog." Marcus blinked, surprised by her lack of tears. "The axe is a Gable tool?" "It was his," she repeated, her gaze unwavering. "And the dog will not stay here without him. He follows me." A low growl from the corner affirmed her words. Boulder, Thomas's old hound, a brute of a dog with a coat the color of granite, lifted his head and stared directly at Marcus. A flicker of annoyance, or perhaps fear, crossed Marcus's face. He gave a curt nod. "Fine, take them. A fool's dog for a fool's errand." He pushed a small, heavy purse across the table. $50, the family's final charity. Do not come back to Providence when it runs out. The door closed behind her with a definitive click. Alara stood on the porch, the cold biting at her cheeks. She had been officially erased. She was no longer a Gable. She was just a widow with a worthless deed, a loyal dog, an axe, and $77. The town of Providence watched her go. She saw the pity in the eyes of Mr. Finch at the Mercantile as she spent a precious portion of her money not on a stagecoach ticket east, but on a bag of salt, a sack of flour, a tin of lard, a sharp knife, and a heavy wool blanket. "There's nothing for you out there, missus," he'd said, his voice a low murmur. "That land will kill you before the first big snow." "This land is mine," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. She refused his pity, refused the condescending advice from the pastor to accept a room in the church poorhouse. She turned her back on the smoke curling from the chimneys of Providence, squared her shoulders against the wind, and with Boulder trotting faithfully at her side, began the long walk toward the frozen edge of the world. The journey to Grayling Lake was a lesson in hostility. The path dwindled from a wagon-rutted track to a barely discernible animal trail. The sparse, hardy pines gave way to stunted, wind-twisted shrubs that clawed at her skirts. The weight of her supplies, lashed to a crude travois she'd fashioned from 2 poles and the wool blanket, dug into her shoulders. Each step was a battle against the crushing isolation and the biting wind that seemed to whisper of failure. Boulder stayed close, a warm and solid presence in the vast, empty landscape. She arrived at dusk when the weak sun was a pale, bloody smear on the horizon. And she saw it, the barrens. It was worse than the stories. A vast, shimmering sheet of gray ice, stretched out to meet the sky, utterly flat and featureless. The edge of the lake was not a shore, but a low, jagged cliff of black rock, perhaps 20 feet high, looking like a row of broken teeth. The wind howled across the ice, a physical force that struck her like a hammer, stealing her breath and burning her exposed skin. This was it, her inheritance, a grave. For a moment, her iron resolve cracked. Despair, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced her heart. Her knees felt weak, and the sting of tears, hot then instantly frozen, touched her cheeks. Mr. Finch was right. Marcus was right. The whole town was right. This place was death. She sank to her knees, the weight of it all finally crushing her. Boulder nudged her hand with his cold nose, then whined, a low, anxious sound. He looked at her, then toward the black cliff face, and trotted purposefully toward it. He stopped at a place where a great slab of rock had fallen away, revealing a dark, vertical fissure, no wider than a man's shoulders. He whined again, a clear invitation. Driven by a flicker of curiosity, or perhaps just the need to get out of the relentless wind, Alara followed. She pushed through the narrow opening into the lee of the rock. The change was immediate and staggering. The deafening roar of the wind vanished, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. The air was still, not just still, but different, less sharp, less cruel. She reached out and laid her bare palm against the black rock of the cliff face. She expected a surface as cold as death, but it wasn't. It was not warm, not by any means, but it was not the biting, soul-stealing cold of everything else in this forsaken land. The dark, porous stone had soaked up the meager daylight, and now it held a faint, residual energy, a deep, resonant lack of cold that felt like a promise. It was thermal mass, a memory of warmth. Her fingers traced a crack in the rock. She felt a subtle, almost imperceptible dampness. Leaning closer, she saw it. A single, glistening drop of water forming at the tip of a stone needle, swelling, and then falling with a soft pat to the rock below. It did not freeze on impact. Deep within the rock, somewhere beyond the reach of the frost, was water. The worthless place had a secret. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. The town was wrong. The first week was an exercise in brutal, relentless labor. Ilara's world shrank to the fissure in the rock, the weight of her axe, and the screaming protest of muscles she never knew she had. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and baking, were the first to surrender. Blisters rose, broke, and bled, leaving her palms raw and burning. She wrapped them in strips torn from her petticoat and kept working. The pain was a constant companion, a fire that she learned to live with. Her first task was to widen the fissure, using the heavy pole of Thomas's axe as a hammer and a sharpened piece of rock as a wedge. She attacked the cracks in the stone. It was agonizingly slow work. Hours of pounding would yield only a handful of rubble. But each stone she pried loose was a victory. Each inch of space she gained was a foot of new territory in her war against the wilderness. Boulder would watch her, his head cocked, occasionally digging furiously at the loose scree as if to help. The rock she excavated became the material for her front wall. She had seen stonemasons in Providence building foundations, and she tried to mimic their careful, interlocking patterns. Her first attempts were clumsy, unstable piles of rock that tumbled with the slightest nudge. She learned through failure. She learned that a wide base was essential, that the largest stones had to be at the bottom, and that every stone had a face that wanted to sit flush against another. She discovered a deposit of dense gray clay near the base of the cliff, wet from the same hidden seep that fed her fissure. She mixed it with water and dry grasses, creating a crude but effective mortar that filled the gaps and bound the stones together. Slowly, painstakingly, a wall began to rise, enclosing the space in front of the cliff face. It was not straight or beautiful, but it was solid. It was hers. She left a narrow opening for a door and a smaller square for a window The few stunted, wind-blasted pines in a sheltered draw a mile away provided the wood. Felling the first tree was a monumental struggle. The axe felt impossibly heavy, her swings awkward and inefficient. But it fell. She limbed it, her whole body trembling with exhaustion, and spent 2 days dragging the logs back to her shelter. They became a door frame, a window frame, and the sturdy lintel above them. Her second system was heat. A simple fire pit in the middle of the floor would be wasteful, the heat rising and vanishing. She remembered Thomas talking about the old country, of stone farmhouses with massive hearths that warmed the entire home. She decided to build her fireplace directly against the back wall of the cave, the great solid mass of the cliff itself. She constructed a deep firebox from the flattest stone she could find, mortared with her thick clay. Above it, she noticed a natural vertical crack extending upwards through the rock. It was a chimney carved by nature. With a long pole, she cleared it of loose debris until she could see a sliver of gray sky far above. The first time she lit a fire, it was a moment of pure magic. The dry pine caught quickly, and after a tense moment of smoke filling the small space, the draft caught. The smoke was pulled up the fissure, vanishing into the cliff. The fire roared to life, and the heat began to pour not just into the room, but into the stone behind it. For hours she fed the flames, watching the black rock of the back wall absorb the energy. That night, long after the fire had died to embers, the stone itself began to breathe warmth back into the shelter. It was a giant silent radiator, a battery of heat. She slept soundly for the first time, curled in her wool blanket with Boulder at her feet, the deep, penetrating warmth of the earth, holding the killing cold at bay. It worked. After 3 weeks, she knew she needed more than salt and flour to survive the winter. She needed life. Leaving Boulder to guard her half-finished home, she made the long journey back to Providence. Her appearance caused a stir at the mercantile. She was leaner, her face weathered, her hands scarred and calloused. The townsfolk stared, whispering amongst themselves. They had expected her to be dead or gone. "Back so soon?" Mr. Finch asked, a smug little smile playing on his lips. "Decided the poorhouse ain't so bad after all?" Alara ignored him. "I need to buy livestock," she said. The mockery in his eyes turned to disbelief. He and the other men in the store laughed. "Livestock? For what? To feed the wolves out on the barrens?" She did not waver. She bought 2 laying hens and a pregnant nanny goat from a farmer on the edge of town, a man whose pity outweighed his skepticism. He sold them to her cheap, certain he was sending the poor creatures to their doom. She spent more of her dwindling cash at the mercantile on a small bag of seed potatoes, a packet of turnip seeds, nails, and a length of wire. Mr. Finch counted her money with a shake of his head, muttering about fools and their fortunes. Leading a stubborn goat and carrying 2 squawking chickens in a crate was a slow, arduous journey back. The community watched her leave, their judgment hanging heavy in the air. They saw a madwoman, a cave widow, as some had started to call her, marching to her own funeral. They did not see the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the methodical purpose in her every move. Back at her shelter, she immediately set to work on her next systems. The water source was paramount. She spent a week carefully chipping away at the rock floor of the cave, deepening the natural depression where the water collected. She lined it with a thick layer of her best clay, creating a small, clean cistern that held a constant supply of fresh, unfrozen water. It was the greatest luxury imaginable. For the animals, she built an enclosure inside her main shelter against the warm back wall. A low stone wall, reinforced with a crude wattle fence, created a pen where the goat and chickens were safe from predators and the cold. The goat's body heat and the gentle clucking of the hens added another layer of life and warmth to the space. Her most ambitious project was the garden. Deep inside the cave, where the temperature remained stable and the geothermal warmth from the seep kept the frost away, she planned to grow food. Over many days, she hauled buckets of dark, rich soil from the sheltered pine grove, a back-breaking task. She built 3 shallow, long boxes from scrap wood and filled them with the soil. In this manufactured earth, under the faint, reflected light from her fire, she planted the seed potatoes and turnip seeds. It felt like an act of defiant faith, planting life in the heart of stone. Her companion through it all was Boulder. The big dog was more than a guard. He was her shadow, her confidant, her only link to the life she had lost. He lay by the fire while she worked, his presence a silent comfort. He walked the perimeter of their small territory each morning, a self-appointed sentinel. At night, he slept pressed against her back, a warm, breathing anchor in the vast, cold darkness. The bond between them, forged in shared loss and shared labor, was absolute. One afternoon a rider appeared, a dark figure against the blinding white of the lake. It was Marcus Gable. He reined in his horse a safe distance away, his face a mask of arrogant disbelief. He had clearly come to see the site of her failure, to confirm his own sound judgment. What he saw instead was a solid stone wall, a sturdy door, and a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising from the cliff face itself. "So you've managed to build a tomb," he called out, his voice dripping with scorn. "Very fitting. At least they'll know where to find the body." He scanned the unforgiving landscape. "You'll be dead by Christmas, Ilara, starved or frozen. This is a grave you're digging on the grayling." The name stuck in his throat and he rode off, laughing. Ilara watched him go, then turned and went back inside her shelter. His words were meant to be a curse, but she heard them as a challenge. She stoked the fire, feeling the deep, steady warmth of the stone against her back. Let him call it a grave. She was building a life. The deep winter arrived not with a whisper, but a roar. The sky turned a permanent bruised gray, and the sun became a distant, powerless memory. The world outside Ilara's shelter became an abstract concept, a maelstrom of wind and driven snow she only knew through sound. The wind moaned against her stone walls, a constant, mournful cry. It clawed at the wooden door and screamed through the tiniest cracks she had yet to chink. But inside, her world was small, warm, and ordered. Her days fell into a steady, comforting rhythm, a liturgy of survival. She would wake before the light, the air cool but not frigid. Her first act was always to tend the fire, adding logs she had painstakingly cut and stacked against the interior wall. The fire was the heart of her home, and she tended it with a devotion bordering on worship. With the fire blazing, the great stone wall would begin to radiate its deep, penetrating heat, and the shelter would fill with a gentle, life-giving warmth. Next were the animals. The goat, now heavy with kid, would bleat a soft greeting. Ilara would milk her, the warm milk hissing into the wooden pail, a welcome sound in the quiet morning. She fed the chickens a portion of her own ground corn, and their cheerful clucking was a constant reminder of life. Their 2 daily eggs were treasures, carefully collected and stored. Water came from the cistern, always clean, always flowing. She would check her garden boxes, marveling at the miracle of pale green potato shoots and the hardy tops of turnips pushing through the dark soil. In the heart of a frozen world, she was cultivating life. The routine was everything. Stoke the fire, milk the goat, feed the hens, check the garden, check the walls for new drafts, carve a spoon from a piece of scrap pine, mend a tear in her dress. Each small, purposeful act was a declaration of existence, a refusal to surrender to the vast, white emptiness outside. She was utterly alone, but she was not helpless. She was the sovereign of her small, stone kingdom. Before the great blizzard, smaller tests came to prove her systems. One night, a wolf pack, driven by hunger, descended from the high country. Boulder's deep, ferocious barks were the first alarm. Ilara peered through a crack in her door and saw a dozen pairs of yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. They circled, testing the perimeter, but her stone walls were impassable. They could smell the goat, a tantalizing promise of a meal, but they could not reach it. The solid door, barred from the inside, held firm. After an hour of frustrated howling, they moved on, defeated by stone and wood. Her shelter was a fortress. Another test came as a quick, violent storm that dropped 2 feet of snow in a single night. She woke to a world of muffled silence, her door and window completely blocked by a massive drift. For a moment panic flared. But the fire drew perfectly, its smoke finding its way up the natural chimney. She had food, water, and warmth. She was not trapped, she was protected. It took her half a day to dig her way out, but the experience taught her that her shelter did not fight the winter. It simply endured it, letting the worst of the fury pass over. She had built well. The scorn of Providence, the mockery of Marcus Gable, felt like echoes from another lifetime. Here, in the world she had made with her own 2 hands, she was not the cave widow or the fool on the barrens. She was a builder, she was a survivor, and she was ready. The great blizzard of '83 arrived. Like an invading army, it began with a sky the color of lead, and a silence that felt heavy and expectant. Then the wind came, a low growl that rose to a piercing, relentless shriek. It carried snow not as flakes, but as a horizontal wall of blinding white, a scouring force that erased the landscape. The world outside became a formless, roaring chaos. The storm did not just blow, it battered. It struck the cliff face like 1,000 hammers, seeking entry, seeking to devour the small pocket of warmth Ilara had carved from the stone. Inside, there was an almost sacred calm. The fire in the hearth burned with a steady, hypnotic pulse. The great black stone at her back was a reservoir of deep, unshakable warmth, a silent testament to the sun's forgotten memory. The wind could scream and rage, but it could not touch the heat stored in the heart of the rock. Her shelter was an island of tranquility in an ocean of violence. The goat and her 2 newborn kids, born just a week prior, rested peacefully in their pen. The chickens roosted, unperturbed. Ilara sat by the fire, mending a sock, listening to the storm's fury, as one might listen to distant, harmless thunder. She was not fighting the storm, she was simply outside its reach. In Providence, the storm was not a distant roar, it was an executioner. The town's confidence, built of wood and pride, shattered within the first day. The wind, funneled between the buildings, tore shingles from roofs and shattered windows. Snow piled in drifts that buried doorways and crushed porch roofs. The clapboard walls of the houses, so sturdy in the summer sun, offered little resistance to the penetrating, killing cold. Families huddled around their iron stoves, feeding them constantly, only to find the heat sucked away as fast as it was produced. By the second day, the town systems were collapsing. Firewood, thought to be plentiful, was running out at an alarming rate. The communal well froze solid. The roof of the livery stable collapsed under the weight of the snow, killing half the horses inside. The great bell in the church steeple, shrinking in the intense cold, cracked with a sound like a rifle shot that was swallowed by the wind. Panic began to set in. The people of Providence, so sure of their civilized superiority, were trapped. Their homes were becoming ice boxes, their preparations laughably inadequate. They were facing the raw, untamed power they had mocked Ilara for embracing, and it was destroying them. On the 3rd day of the storm, as Ilara was ladling goat milk stew into a bowl, a new sound cut through the howl of the wind. It was a frantic, desperate banging on her door. It was a sound so human, so terrified, that it felt alien in her world of stone and fire. Boulder erupted in a volley of deep barks, hackles raised. Ilara unbarred the heavy wooden door. It took all her strength to push it open against the packed snow. A figure, completely encrusted in ice and snow, stumbled forward and collapsed onto her floor. It was a woman, and in the bundle she clutched to her chest was a small child. Ilara dragged the woman inside, forcing the door shut against the raging storm. She pulled back the hood of the snow-caked cloak. It was Lydia Gable, Marcus's wife. Her face was a mask of frozen tears and terror. The child in her arms, a boy of 3, was pale and still, his breathing shallow and ragged. He was burning with fever. "Help us!" Lydia gasped, her voice a raw croak. "Please, our firewood is gone. The house is as cold as a tomb. Marcus, he went out to check the cattle. He hasn't come back." For a fleeting second, Alara felt the bitter sting of every insult, every dismissive glance, every cruel laugh. Here at her door was the embodiment of the world that had cast her out, now begging for the very survival she had been forced to build. Her carefully rationed wood, her precious food, her hard-won sanctuary, they were asking for it all. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. She looked at the desperate mother and the sick child, and she saw not the wife of her tormentor, but 2 human beings on the verge of death. Her choice was not a choice at all. It was a simple, unspoken law of the world she now inhabited. You help. Not because they deserved it, but because she could. "Bring the boy to the fire," Alara said, her voice calm and steady. She took a blanket from her cot and wrapped it around the child. She ladled a bowl of warm broth and pressed it into Lydia's trembling hands. She moved with an economy of motion, her actions practical and immediate. She was no longer a victim seeking vindication. She was a protector, a provider. She ventured out into the blinding storm, tethered to her shelter by a rope, and brought back armloads of precious firewood from her covered stack, using her own stores to save the family of the man who had wished her dead. As the warmth of the shelter began to thaw Lydia Gable, her shock gave way to utter, dumbfounded awe. She looked around the small, circular space, her eyes wide with disbelief. This was not the dark, filthy hovel she had imagined. It was a home. A fire burned brightly in a stone hearth that radiated a deep, bone-soaking warmth. The air smelled of wood smoke, savory stew, and dry earth. Tallow lamps cast a soft, golden glow on the stone walls, which were hung with neatly organized tools. In one corner, a goat and 2 kids rested peacefully on a bed of clean straw. A handful of chickens clucked softly in their enclosure. But the most stunning sight was against the far wall. In 3 long wooden boxes, under the faint light, were rows of green plants. Potato shoots, pale but healthy, reached for the ceiling. The feathery tops of turnips were a vibrant, impossible green. Life, growing in the heart of a frozen wasteland. Lydia stared, unable to reconcile the reality of this place with the derisive stories told in town. They had called Alara the cave widow, a madwoman digging her own grave. They had laughed at her folly, but this was not folly, this was genius. It was a self-contained world, a fortress of life and warmth that mocked the grand, failing houses of Providence. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, a search party from the town, gaunt and frostbitten, followed the strange, smokeless chimney they had finally spotted against the cliff. They found Marcus Gable in a snowdrift, alive but barely, saved by the hide of a dead steer he had sheltered under. They brought him to Alara's door. He stumbled inside, his face a ruin of frostbite and shame. He saw his wife, safe. He saw his son, weak but past the worst of the fever, sleeping peacefully by the fire. He saw the impossible shelter, the animals, the garden. He looked at the woman he had driven out into the wilderness, the woman he had sentenced to death. She stood by the fire, her face calm, her eyes holding no triumph, only a quiet, weary strength. The full weight of his arrogance, of the town's collective, prideful ignorance, crashed down upon him. They, with their sturdy houses and their deep cellars, had nearly perished. She, with nothing but a worthless piece of rock, had thrived. "We were wrong, Alara," he choked out, the words tearing from his raw throat. "My God, we were the fools." Alara's response was the purest form of grace. She did not say a word of reproach. She did not remind him of his cruelty. She simply ladled a bowl of hot stew and handed it to him. "There is food," she said. "Eat." In that simple act of kindness, her victory was absolute. In the days after the great blizzard, the relationship between Providence and the woman on the lakebed transformed completely. The survivors, humbled and battered, came to her shelter not with mockery, but with a quiet, desperate reverence. They came to trade what little they had left, a bag of nails for a dozen eggs, a bolt of cloth for a pail of goat's milk. More than that, they came to learn. They saw how her stone walls held the heat, how her natural chimney drew the smoke, how her cistern provided endless water. They saw a system, an intelligence born of necessity that had triumphed where their conventional wisdom had failed. The derisive nickname, "the grave on the grayling," was never spoken again. Instead, a new name emerged, whispered with respect around the few remaining fires in town: the hearthstone. It was no longer her shelter, it was a landmark. Marcus Gable, his face permanently scarred by the frost, stepped down from his position on the town council. The authority he had wielded with such arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet public shame. He never spoke to Alara again, but twice a year a wagon-load of cut, seasoned oak would be left near her path, a silent, anonymous tribute. Alara's story spread. Travelers carried the tale of the widow who had built a home from a rock and survived the blizzard that nearly wiped a town off the map. Her methods, once seen as madness, became gospel. When the people of Providence rebuilt, they built differently. They built with stone foundations dug deep into the earth. They positioned their homes to catch the winter sun and to turn their backs to the prevailing wind. They learned from the rock, from the wind, from the woman they had cast out. The settlement and the people in it became more resilient, more humble, more enduring. Alara never left the hearthstone. It was more than a home, it was a part of her. She lived a quiet, solitary life, surrounded by the rhythms she had established in that first brutal winter. The spring thaw would come, and the great gray lake would glitter under the sun. She would stand at the door of her shelter, the warm stone at her back, and look out at the world. She was not a victim. She was not the Gable widow. She was Alara of the hearthstone, a woman who had been given nothing but a worthless rock and had used it to build a life. She had been stripped of everything, but in the end she had found that what truly mattered, strength, ingenuity, and a quiet, unyielding grace, could not be taken away. It could only be built.